Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
My sister Chelsea got a house for Christmas, an actual house, with a ribbon wrapped around the keys and a smiling realtor standing in the driveway waiting to hand them over. I sat there holding a coffee cup that had started to cool in my hands, while everyone clapped like they were watching the birth of Jesus himself. Chelsea looked fake humble, her mouth doing that tight little, oh my god, you guys, thing she always did when she knew she'd won. She wiped away a tear with her French-tipped fingernail like this was all just too much to process, though I'm willing to bet she knew it was coming the second Dad asked if she could stop by the house before they opened gifts. I got a sweater. A soft one, to be fair, navy blue, good material, but I could smell the clearance rack on it before I even opened the box. I smiled and said thank you because that's what I do. That's what I've always done. Smile. Nod. Be easy. Don't take up space. Don't expect too much. Definitely don't get jealous when the daughter who crashed 2 cars and still doesn't pay her own phone bill gets a 3-bedroom ranch-style gift wrapped for the holidays. I took a slow sip of coffee, met my dad's eyes across the room, and said, in the calmest tone I could muster, I got you something too. My voice sliced the sugar-thick room in half. He blinked, surprised, like I'd interrupted something. I guess I had. Mom glanced over and did her best pageant smile, the one she uses in church when someone awkward sits next to her, and asked, "You did? That's sweet, honey." She always said honey like it had a leash attached. I reached into my bag and pulled out a simple white envelope, nothing fancy, not even sealed. Just folded once, letter inside. My name written on the back in tiny cursive. I handed it to my father, not my mother, even though I knew the moment she saw it, she'd snatch it from his hands. And sure enough, she did. Barbara, yes, I call my mother Barbara in my head, always have, opened the letter with one hand while still holding her wine glass in the other. There was no flourish, no speech, no performative thank you. Just her eyes scanning the sentence, brow furrowing, lips parting just enough for her breath to catch. Her hand dropped slightly, wine sloshing over the rim of the glass onto the hardwood floor, unnoticed. Ron, my father, tilted his head toward her and squinted. "What is this?" he asked, voice low and cautious, like he already sensed the answer wasn't good. I took another sip of coffee. It had gone lukewarm, but the bitterness hit right. I didn't say anything, didn't try to explain or soften the blow. I just sat there in my discount sweater and watched my mother gasp like someone had punched her in the gut with a memory she'd worked decades to bury. Chelsea, meanwhile, was still grinning like an idiot, oblivious to the shift in temperature. She was showing her kids the big red bow they'd stuck to the garage door, making loud, can you believe it, noises to fill the silence. She hadn't noticed yet that something had snapped in the room behind her. But she would. Oh, she would. You have to understand something before you judge me. This wasn't about jealousy. This wasn't about the house or the sweater or the 10,000 other microslaps I'd swallowed over the years. This was about silence. Long, echoing silence that hung over my life like fog on a 2-lane country road. The kind of silence that comes not from ignorance, but from active, deliberate omission. From people who know the truth and choose not to say it because it's inconvenient. Because it might mess up their carefully curated little family Christmas. Because it might change the way someone looks at the golden child. This was never about the money. If it was, I would have sued years ago. There were ways, I had enough documentation. But that's not my style. I'm not loud. I don't scream in public or throw things or threaten to cut people off on Facebook. I wait. I wait until I know exactly what to say, and when to say it, and I write it down in one clean sentence that I know will detonate on impact. And that's what I did. There was one sentence in the letter. Just one. I wrote it with no emotion, no embellishment, just pure fact. It was enough to make Barbara look like she'd aged 10 years in a second. Ron had started leaning forward, trying to peek over her shoulder, but she was holding the letter like it was a grenade she couldn't disarm. Her lips moved silently. Her eyes flicked to me and then away again, like maybe if she didn't see me, none of this was happening. Chelsea finally looked over. "What's going on?" she asked, the edges of her voice pinched with irritation. She hated not being the center of attention. Mom tried to recover. It's nothing, she said, voice shrill and fake sweet again. Just something personal. About what? Chelsea pressed. Ron finally stood up, walked to the kitchen window, and stared out at the driveway where the house keys still sat on the table next to Chelsea's peppermint latte. He didn't say anything for a full 30 seconds, but I could see it in his jaw, the clench, the release, the clench again. That's the thing about Ron. He rarely says anything unless he absolutely has to. That's why this moment mattered. He turned, slowly, and asked again, "Wait, what is this?" Not to me. To Barbara. And she didn't answer. Because she couldn't. I took one more sip of coffee, crossed my legs, and smiled. Not a vengeful smile, not a gloating one. Just a quiet little smile that said, "Finally, you don't get to pretend you don't know." That was my gift. And trust me, it was worth a hell of a lot more than a mortgage and a bow. People like to say that every family has its favorites, that it's just human nature. That some kids are simply easier to love because they're quieter or cuter or funnier or just more agreeable in that unspoken way that makes parents sigh with relief instead of tension, and maybe that's true. Maybe it's just the way things work sometimes without anybody meaning for it to happen, but when you grow up as the not favorite, you don't forget the feeling of being measured, watched, and weighed against. Someone who always seems to win, even when they show up late, do less, lie more, and never once think to clean up the mess they leave behind, because they've been trained to believe that someone else always will. Chelsea wasn't evil, not really, at least not in the classic way you'd see in a Lifetime movie or one of those viral Reddit posts where the sister poisons the wedding cake or steals the baby name, but she was so deeply entitled that she wore it like perfume. Sweet and cloying, filling the room before she even opened her mouth, and the worst part was that it worked on strangers, on teachers, on boyfriends, and especially on my parents, who treated her every stumble like a precious lesson from which she would grow stronger, while every one of my successes was met with a nod, a "that's nice," or a question about why I wasn't dating anyone yet. She was the kind of person who could call our mom at 3 in the morning, sobbing because she couldn't make her rent after buying a designer stroller on credit, and within 12 hours there'd be an envelope of cash waiting for her on the counter, no questions asked. No lectures, just soft reassurances and gentle hugs and reminders that everyone makes mistakes, sweetheart, it's okay, while I, the responsible one, the planner, the one who spent her 20s paying off student loans and building a career, would get passive-aggressive Christmas cards about how it's not too late to have a family, and you really should come to church more often, Aaron. When Chelsea wrecked her first car, a birthday gift she'd gotten at 17, brand new, of course, my parents cried, not because she'd been drinking, or because the car was a total loss, but because they didn't want her to feel bad about herself. And when I asked them why there were no consequences, why no one was grounding her or taking away the keys, they looked at me like I'd asked why we don't punish toddlers for spilling juice. "She's going through a lot right now," Mom said, as if hormones and popularity were an acceptable excuse for endangering lives. When I asked what I was going through at her age, she blinked like the question had never occurred to her. I learned early not to compete because the game was rigged from the start. Chelsea had a way of making chaos look charming, of turning every disaster into a story that ended with someone else saying, "You poor thing," and offering her a ride home. I used to think it was manipulation, but now I think it's worse than that, it's instinct. Somewhere deep down, she knew that as long as she kept playing the part of the fragile favorite, the world would bend to accommodate her fragility. Which brings me to Christmas dinner, the part after the house keys and before the fallout, when we all sat around the table pretending to be a functioning family, passing sweet potatoes and wine, with Chelsea perched like a duchess at the head of the table, regaling everyone with tales of her toddler's latest tantrum and the stress of remodeling a bathroom she hadn't paid for, while Mom made those little affirming noises and Dad quietly kept pouring himself more wine than usual. I barely spoke, and no one seemed to notice. I just watched, like I always do, taking in the dynamic I'd memorized years ago, Barbara directing the mood like a conductor, Ron watching the tablecloth like it might leap up and choke him, Chelsea performing for an audience that had long since forgotten I was part of the cast. Then, out of nowhere, Chelsea lifted her glass and said something so perfectly polished and performative that I almost laughed aloud. "I just want to say how grateful I am for this family," she said, with misty eyes and a voice just trembly enough to pass for sincerity. "I don't know where I'd be without all of you, especially Mom and Dad, who've done so much for me. I mean, this house, it's more than I deserve." I opened my mouth before I had time to stop myself. "That's the first honest thing you've said all night." Silence. The kind of silence that freezes the room in place. Chelsea blinked, caught off guard, and tried to laugh it off, but there was an edge in her voice now. "What's that supposed to mean?" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "Do you remember who paid for Grandma's hospice care the last 3 months?" I asked, turning toward her, but letting my eyes flick briefly to our mother, just long enough to make her flinch. Chelsea looked confused, like she hadn't known Grandma needed hospice care, or maybe like she didn't remember that it cost anything, which was entirely possible since she hadn't visited more than twice. "I thought that was covered," she said, frowning. "Wasn't it in the estate?" I smiled, but there was no kindness in it. "No, Chelsea. It wasn't. You know what was in the estate? A letter." Barbara set her fork down. Slowly. Carefully. Ron looked up from his glass for the first time in 10 minutes. "A letter?" Chelsea repeated. "Yeah," I said, sipping water like it was wine. "From Grandma. Not to you." There was a beat then too. I didn't need to say more, not yet. I wanted the seed to take root. I wanted the confusion to curl its fingers around them and squeeze, slow and steady. Barbara reached for her napkin but missed. Her hand was shaking. Ron was staring at me now, the way you stare at someone you thought you knew, right before they do something that rewrites everything you believed about them. And Chelsea, bless her golden little heart, was starting to get nervous. Which was good. Because nervous was only the beginning. The thing about silence is that, over time, it stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like protection, like if you just stay quiet long enough. Maybe the storm will pass, maybe the truth will forget you're holding it. Maybe the ghosts will grow tired of pacing and finally settle, but silence is greedy. It feeds on your breath and swallows whole years without apology, and eventually, if you let it go unchecked, it doesn't just suffocate your voice, it eats at your memory. Your sense of worth, your trust in the shape of things, until the only way to survive is to rip it open from the inside and bleed whatever's been buried into the light. That moment began for me not on a dramatic day, not during some confrontation or holiday or fight, but on an ordinary Thursday, 3 months after Grandma Jean died, when I was helping clear out her apartment, alone, of course, because Barbara had a bad back and Chelsea just couldn't emotionally handle it right now, as if emotion had ever stopped her from doing anything she wanted before, and I had reached the back of the closet in the guest room, the one where Grandma kept her old shoeboxes and tax papers and the little cedar box that always smelled faintly of peppermint and cigarette smoke. I remember that I was sweating, tired, and not particularly sentimental in that moment. I'd already gone through so many drawers of yellowed receipts and brittle letters that I felt more like a bank auditor than a grieving granddaughter. And I almost missed the envelope because it was taped to the underside of the lid inside the cedar box, barely visible unless you knew where to look or were as methodical as I had become by that point. The envelope was thin, hand-labeled in Grandma's neat cursive, "Aaron, open only if they pretend she never existed." It didn't say who they were, but I didn't need her to tell me. They had always been the same people, the ones who let Chelsea skip visits and then cried the loudest at the funeral, the ones who used Grandma's name in family prayers but rolled their eyes when she talked about things that happened before they were born, the ones who never asked where her money went, just assumed it would all come to them when the time was right. I didn't open the letter right away. I carried it in my coat pocket for almost 2 weeks, staring at it in moments of solitude, at red lights, in the grocery store parking lot, before going to bed, wondering whether it was love or cruelty that made her leave something like that behind, and what it would mean if it was both. When I finally unfolded it, late one night with a glass of scotch and my phone turned off, it wasn't long or poetic, no dramatic declarations or riddles to solve, just Grandma's signature honesty, dry and unsentimental as always. She wrote that she knew what they'd done, what they'd kept from me, what they'd spun into half-truths and whispered away behind closed doors, and that while she hadn't told me while she was alive. Partly because she didn't want to ruin whatever scraps of relationship I still had with them, she also believed I deserved to know the truth if the silence ever became unbearable. She enclosed 3 things: a bank ledger, a hospital discharge form from 1987, and, folded into a worn paper napkin from the diner we used to go to, a DNA test that changed everything I thought I knew. It turns out that my father, Ron, isn't my biological father. Not entirely shocking, considering the way he always seemed to hover near me rather than around me, like I was a piece of furniture he couldn't quite remember purchasing. But the real twist wasn't about me. It was about Chelsea. Because Chelsea wasn't Barbara's biological daughter. That fact hit me like cold water over the spine, not because I had some desperate need to cling to bloodlines or labels, but because it explained everything that never made sense. Why Barbara was always trying to fix me but never listened. Why Ron treated Chelsea like a fragile heirloom he was terrified to crack. Why every single family portrait looked like a performance we all agreed not to interrupt. According to the documents, Chelsea had been born during a brief separation between my parents, and while Barbara had been vocal about her disdain for Ron's failings during that period, she had conveniently never mentioned that she'd had a whole other man. One who left her when he found out she was pregnant, leaving Ron to come back, reconcile, and, like a good husband with a wounded conscience, raise a child that wasn't his with the kind of devotion you reserve for the things you feel you need to prove. Suddenly, every memory had a new meaning. The whispered arguments behind closed doors. The tension that cracked through family vacations like thunder just out of reach. The way Barbara clung to Chelsea with such obsessive protectiveness, while treating me like a homework assignment she couldn't wait to be finished with. It all made sense, because Chelsea was the living proof of Barbara's mistake, a child born of guilt, shame, and narrative correction. And I was the one she couldn't control, because I looked too much like her truth. I kept the letter hidden for 5 years. 5 years of birthdays, Christmases, funerals, baby showers, and passive-aggressive texts about how I was too distant and should really make more of an effort to be part of the family. 5 years of watching Chelsea rack up favor like frequent flyer miles, each new screw-up repackaged as growth, while I sat quietly through every smug story, every side-eyed compliment, every forced hug from people who didn't know that I was holding a grenade in my purse every time I came over. But grenades only work if you let them explode at the right time. That time came the morning I handed my parents the envelope at Christmas. Inside the letter I gave them, written in a font so clean and cold it could have come from a legal notice, was just one line: "You should have told her who her real mother was before I did." There was no signature, no context, just a single sentence that carried 5 years of silence, 5 years of knowing, 5 years of choosing to wait for the moment when the power of truth wouldn't just shake the table, it would flip it. Barbara gasped like I'd stabbed her. Ron looked like someone had pulled the floor out from under his feet. And me? I just sat back in my chair, crossed my legs, and thought about how Grandma had always said that the truth doesn't set you free until it burns a hole through every lie you've ever swallowed. The hole was open now, and the fire was just beginning to spread. If you've ever watched a lie unravel in real time, you'll understand what I mean when I say that it doesn't happen like it does in the movies. There's no dramatic thunderclap, no shattering of glass, no one screaming down a hallway or collapsing to their knees in theatrical agony. Instead, it's quieter, slower, almost surgical, as if the air itself is waiting to see who will blink first, who will lie again to cover the first lie, and who, finally, will break the silence with something that can't be unsaid, can't be swept away with another pot of coffee or some panicked offer of pie. That's exactly what it felt like in that living room, once the letter had been opened and read, once the truth had stepped into the middle of our carefully wrapped Christmas morning and refused to leave. Barbara sat there holding the paper like it might bite her, her face frozen in a mixture of rage and fear that she hadn't worn in front of me since I was 16, and asked her, in front of a neighbor, why she never came to my track meets. Ron, still standing by the kitchen doorway, hadn't moved in minutes, as if immobilized by the weight of something he couldn't yet name out loud. And Chelsea, golden, oblivious, glittering Chelsea, who had been so happily entertaining her children with the promise of their new bedrooms and backyard adventures, finally turned her head and noticed the crack in the air. "What's going on?" she asked, irritation curling the corners of her voice, because if there was one thing Chelsea couldn't stand, it was being out of the loop, especially when the attention had shifted away from her and the applause had suddenly gone silent. Barbara tried, weakly, to fold the letter and stuff it back into the envelope, but her fingers were shaking, and the paper made a crisp, accusatory sound with each movement. "It's nothing," she said, but her voice was too high, too sharp, the kind of tone a woman uses when she's been caught lying, but hasn't yet decided whether to double down or run. I stood up, slowly, and walked past the coffee table where the wrapping paper still lay scattered like battlefield debris, toward the front door, where Chelsea had dropped her designer handbag and coat, because of course she couldn't be bothered to hang them. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out the second envelope, the one I had prepared weeks ago, sealed in thick, creamy cardstock, with her name in large black letters, and turned to her, holding it out like an offering, but with no warmth in my eyes. "This is for you," I said, not even trying to soften it, not anymore. "Merry Christmas, Chelsea." She didn't take it right away. She looked to Mom, then to Dad, then to me again, that deer-in-headlights confusion already taking root behind her eyes, the part of her that had never once prepared for a scenario in which she wasn't the one being protected. "What is it?" she asked, voice small, but not soft. I didn't answer. I just pushed the envelope into her hand and watched her stare at it like it might explode. Then I stepped back, leaned against the wall, and crossed my arms, waiting. And when she opened it, I didn't look away. Inside was a copy of the DNA results, a highlighted excerpt from Grandma's letter, and a small photograph, one she'd never seen, of Barbara, younger, thinner, harder in the face, standing outside a hospital with a man who wasn't Ron, holding a newborn that wasn't quite Chelsea, not yet, but close enough to make the implications undeniable. Chelsea looked up, first at Barbara, who had gone deathly pale, then at Ron, who now looked like he was watching his entire marriage bleed out on the linoleum floor. "What is this?" Chelsea asked, louder now, the panic starting to crack through her perfect posture. I answered before anyone else could. "That's your real mother. The woman you call Mom? She's not who you think she is. And the man who raised you? He's not your father. Not by blood. You were born during a separation. He took you in anyway." She dropped the envelope. It hit the floor with a flat, dry sound, followed by her breathing, quick and jagged, like she'd just come up from underwater, trying to decide whether to scream or cry or both. The kids were still playing upstairs, blissfully unaware that the whole foundation of their family tree had just been chopped off at the root. "You're lying," she whispered, but it lacked conviction, like she already knew it wasn't a lie, like some part of her had always known that something didn't add up, but she never dared ask, because asking meant risking the pedestal she'd lived on her whole life. Barbara stood now too, her hands trembling, her jaw working through several false starts before any words came out. "It was complicated," she said, and that was it. That was the sentence she tried to use to summarize decades of deceit, to excuse the kind of manipulation that warps not just memory, but identity. Ron finally spoke then, his voice rough like he hadn't used it in hours. "Why didn't you ever tell me she knew?" he asked Barbara, not with anger, but with a sorrow so thick it clung to the walls. Barbara turned to him slowly, but she didn't answer. She didn't need to. The answer was written all over her face. Pride. Shame. The poisonous kind of control that dresses itself up as protection. Chelsea, still shaking, looked at me, not like a sister, not even like a person, but like someone trying to figure out what she had just become. "Why would you do this now?" she asked, her voice rising. "What do you get out of this?" I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just looked her in the eye and said, "You got a house. I got the truth. We all get what we deserve." She stared at me like she didn't know whether to slap me or thank me. Barbara lunged then, suddenly, maybe to grab the envelope, Maybe to shield Chelsea from the truth. Maybe just to destroy the physical evidence of the life she never wanted anyone to connect back to her. But I stepped in her way. My arm blocked her without hesitation, and my voice, when I spoke, was louder than I'd meant it to be. "Don't you dare," I said. "You had your chance to tell the truth. For 30 years, you let us all live in this fantasy you built out of shame and fear. You do not get to erase it now." She froze, hand still outstretched, the mother in her faltering, the woman underneath showing through, hard, scared, cornered. Then I turned, walked to the stairs, and climbed them 2 at a time, leaving them in the wreckage of the Christmas they'd all been so eager to script like a Hallmark movie. I didn't stop in my old bedroom, didn't pause to breathe, just went straight to my laptop, opened the lid, and checked the status of the scheduled email I had queued to go out at midnight. It was still there, timed and ready, addressed to half a dozen family friends who had always believed that Chelsea was some miraculous story of redemption and grace, a daughter who had overcome the odds with the help of her perfect, loving parents. They would all be receiving attachments now. Not out of spite, not out of revenge, but because the truth has a way of showing up long after the gift wrap's been tossed, long after the dinner's been eaten, long after the lies have started to rot. And when it arrives, it doesn't knock. It walks right in, with mud on its boots and blood on its hands, and says, "Let's finish this." The beauty of a well-executed plan lies not in its complexity or theatrics, but in its precision, its timing, and the quiet certainty that comes from knowing every move has already been made long before the first piece hits the floor, because real revenge, the kind that doesn't burn out in a flash of fury but settles deep into the bone, is not about explosions or raised voices, but about letting the truth walk in, uninvited, and then refusing to help clean up the mess it makes. In the days leading up to Christmas, I had already accepted that I was done with the performance, done with the rituals, done with trying to cram myself into a family structure that only ever had space for me as long as I didn't speak too loudly, didn't ask too much, and didn't make anyone feel uncomfortable. I'd spent years watching that unspoken contract play out at birthdays and holidays, nodding along with inside jokes I was never part of, bringing thoughtful gifts that got left in unopened bags while Chelsea's last-minute shopping received praise like it was divine inspiration, biting my tongue every time Barbara turned an innocent question into a backhanded suggestion, or when Ron avoided eye contact just long enough to pretend he hadn't noticed how the balance of affection was always weighted toward one side of the table. So no, this wasn't impulsive. It wasn't the result of a bad mood or a dramatic outburst. It was a slow burn, a deliberate act, something I had thought through in those quiet hours after work, in therapy sessions where I learned to name things I'd spent a lifetime suppressing, and in long drives where I rehearsed how it might feel to finally stop waiting for someone to hand me the truth and instead pull it out myself like a splinter that had been festering for too many years under the skin. When I had uploaded the scanned documents, the DNA results, the excerpts from Grandma's letter, the dated photograph of Barbara with a man no one in the family had ever met, I didn't do it out of bitterness or malice. Not in the way people like to frame stories like mine, where the scorned sibling finally snaps and lays waste to everything in a blind fury. No, it was calm, surgical. The same way a surgeon cuts into flesh, not because she wants to hurt, but because she knows there's something underneath that's rotting the whole body from the inside out. My goal wasn't to destroy Chelsea or humiliate Barbara or punish Ron for his silence. My goal was clarity, not justice, because justice implies some form of fairness, and fairness had never once lived in our house, but truth, at least, felt like the bare minimum I could deliver. At midnight, as scheduled, the emails went out. The recipients weren't random. They were carefully chosen, an old family friend who always seemed too interested in Barbara's stories, the cousin who had once drunkenly told me I should stand up for myself more, the aunt who adored Chelsea like a second daughter and treated me like a charity case. Each of them received a polite, almost clinical message with no introduction and no commentary, just attachments labeled clearly, timestamps included, the truth sitting there like a ticking clock. I didn't stay up to watch the fallout. Instead, I went out to the porch, wrapped myself in the old blanket Grandma had knitted for me during her chemo days, and sat in the stillness of early morning while the town lay buried in snow, the street silent except for the occasional creak of ice shifting under wind. I drank my coffee slowly, not because it was good, it wasn't, but because it was mine, and I no longer owed anyone the performance of pretending I was fine. My phone buzzed once, then again. Messages came in like clockwork, each name lighting up with the kind of urgency that usually only follows bad news or moral panic. I ignored them. For now, at least. I knew what they would say, some variation of disbelief, confusion, horror, or sanctimonious advice wrapped in concern. Maybe a few people would defend Barbara, say it wasn't their place to judge, suggest that digging up old wounds doesn't help anyone, as if the silence they had all benefited from hadn't been a wound in itself, as if the price of keeping appearances was something I should have continued to pay just to keep their holidays pleasant. Ron called twice. Left one voicemail. His voice was raw, like a man who just discovered he's been an actor in someone else's play and doesn't know whether to ask for a new script or just walk off the stage entirely. I didn't know everything, he said. Please, Aaron, we need to talk. Barbara didn't call. She texted once, and the message was short enough to fit on the screen without scrolling. You went too far. I didn't reply. Because what none of them seemed to understand, what they probably never would, is that going too far only matters if you think there was ever a line to begin with. But for me, the line had been crossed 1,000 times before I ever picked up the pen. When Barbara handed Chelsea my college fund without asking. When Ron told me he just wanted peace, instead of asking me why I was angry. When Grandma died and they tried to erase the woman who had raised me in all the ways they never bothered to. Chelsea, unsurprisingly, was the one who reacted with the most venom. Her message, sent around 3 in the morning, was a long, winding blend of rage and confusion, a flurry of sentences that reeked of wounded pride and genuine disbelief that anyone would dare knock the crown from her head. The first line read, "I hate you. You ruined everything." The last line said, "What kind of person does this?" I thought about that for a while before answering. Then I typed back a single sentence. "No, your mother did that, I just gave you the receipt." I didn't wait for her reply. Instead, I watched the sky lighten, the frost settle in delicate veins across the railing, and felt, for the first time in longer than I could remember, not triumphant, not vindicated, but free. People think revenge is about evening the score, but it's not. Revenge, when done right, is a form of release. It's the moment you stop begging people to see you and start showing them who they've been all along. It's the moment when you let go of the hope that things could have been different, and instead, you make damn sure they'll never be the same again. I don't know what happens next. Maybe Ron will leave. Maybe Barbara will double down. Maybe Chelsea will find a way to spin it all into a sob story that gets her sympathy and forgiveness from the very people who always forgave her too easily. Maybe I'll be the villain in their story from now on, the bitter one, the cruel one, the one who didn't know when to shut up and smile. But honestly, let them tell it however they want. Because I'm not here to fix their version of me. I'm just here to make sure they finally see the mirror. And whether they shatter it or look away, that's their choice. Mine was made a long time ago.